Theosophy Today, an interview program exploring some of the latest ideas on comparative religion, philosophy, science, and the arts. Host for today's program is William Metzger, editor of The Quest and the American Theosophist magazines.
Hello. We're talking today with Dr. Ravi Ravindra, who is professor of physics and chairman of the Department of Religion at Dalhousie University in Canada. We'd like to welcome you here today, Dr. Ravindra, and would like to explore with you some of the questions that really cross the boundaries of science and religion. This seems to many people, I think, is a rather unusual position that you hold, being in both religion and science in an academic setting. Do you find that that's the way most people react?
It is certainly true that most people are somewhat puzzled by my holding this joint position. And of course, since really the whole field of knowledge in any subject has become so technical and so complicated, that it is understandable that people find it a little puzzling. But I think what is more important behind their question, in my judgment, is that they somehow already come at it with a general sort of a cultural assumption that these two things are incompatible. For example, the technical difficulties are there even if, let us say, a person was a professor of physics and biology. It'll be equally complicated. Mm-hmm. But people are not so puzzled by this because they don't really feel that there is necessarily an inherent contradiction in these.
Right.
So I think that is the real problem, in my judgment. And more it strikes me as somewhat peculiar, really, in a way, that we should have so convinced ourselves that these are contradictory or incompatible, or that a human being should stick with one or the other. Because the more, as I think about it, it seems to me hardly a human being exists who doesn't sometimes think, what is his destiny? Where does he come from? Who is he? What is going to happen to him when he dies?
The fundamental questions.
These are, after all the religious questions. And the moment anybody actually asks these questions, at least for that few moments, he is interested in religion.
Yes.
Now, of course, if you take any of these questions a little bit seriously, which is to say that you come back to them often, or you try to undertake a discipline or a path, which could be in prayer or in meditation, or perhaps even as introductory, just reading things from what the other thinkers have said, then you spend more and more time with them. Therefore, now you're doing religion, as far as I'm concerned. Therefore, any questions really to do with one's inner nature are naturally religious questions. On the other hand, I can hardly also imagine a person who is not interested in the universe in which he lives. After all, I find it almost unimaginable that a person is so dull of heart or mind that he is not moved by the plants or the trees or the flowers or the various animals or the various rocks that exist or the stars. And if one, of course, is a little bit more systematic about it, then one is, in a way, a scientist.
Yes. You certainly do find that many scientists do have a kind of a spiritual interest as well that makes itself quite clear.
Well, scientists are also human beings.
Yes.
I think to the extent that one is human, mm-hmm. it could hardly be the case that sometimes, perhaps only fleetingly, these serious questions don't engage them. Because after all, particularly they unfortunately really in a way tend to engage us in moments of sadness. You know, a friend dies, or somebody's husband or wife, father or mother, or a child dies. In such moments, people are driven to ask the, if you like, the more religious questions. While life is ordinarily going on, we are occupied with just maybe making a living or making a name, And often we don't ask these serious questions.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps from that point of view, it may well be that scientists are occupied with their jobs or with their professions or with their discoveries or research,
Yes.
and they don't have the time or even the interest very much to pursue these questions. But there is hardly a scientist or hardly any person really who doesn't sometimes ask these questions.
Right. Now you teach, of course, courses in physics,
Yes?
and then you teach, apart from that, courses in religion. But you also sometimes teach a course that really crosses the boundaries and brings these two together, don't you?
That is true. In a way, initially I had started out by teaching a course just called Science and Religion. And I soon discovered that for many a people, again it's a matter of a cultural background from which people come. For many a people, that sort of a course means as if we should discuss in that, well, how can I now believe in the Bible if the theory of evolution says this, or if the earth was created, let us say, 5 billion years ago, but the Bible says something else. How could I believe in this? And I soon realized that these are not really the kinds of questions that at all interest me or engage me. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, I'm not really persuaded that these are really the right kind of questions at all. So I was more interested in what is it precisely that a scientist actually does when he does science? And similarly, what is it that a religious person actually does when he is being religious? And therefore, I really changed even the title of this course, partly to convey that what I am really interested in is not the sort of questions which are quite sort of to do with how can I believe in this or that. Mm-hmm. So I give a course which is now called Mystical Consciousness in Modern Science, or in fact modern scientific inquiry, even to get away from the science is not something which is frozen as a body of knowledge. So it's more the procedures, the practice of science or the practice of religion that actually interests me. And as far as I'm concerned, mystics are the great practitioners of religion. Others are mostly just talking about, like theologians or philosophers.
It's the difference between the word and the experience, perhaps.
That's right. That's right.
That theology would be a carrying forth of the words about
that's right.
something that we call the religious, whereas mysticism is more the getting inside and experiencing the religious.
I think that's true, and I think sometimes one can have too many words, and therefore really the word disappears in the process.
Mm-hmm. Somebody contrasted as the word and the inner word.
Well, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah.
And I think Tillich had something of a problem with the phrase "the inner word." He said that that's really misleading because the inner word or the mystical experience really is something that you can only experience within, and it doesn't need to be said. And so to call it the word is the inner word is misleading.
I see.
But when you teach this course, what kinds of students do you get in the course?
Well, quite a variety. Perhaps as a rough and ready sort of figure, I have almost half of them from the sciences and half from the humanities, often people either in religion or in philosophy from the humanities. And in the sciences, it's rather curious, at least in my experience. The students seem to be either drawn from physics or from biology. We rarely seem to have students from chemistry or geology. It's rather interesting. I have not thought about this very much. I don't know why it is the case that I don't get students from chemistry or geology, but from physics or biology, I get students.
Do you suppose it has anything to do with all of the things we've been hearing about science and mysticism through people like Fritjof Capra and David Bohm and the Rupert Sheldrake work,
it is possible,
from biology?
But even otherwise, I would have thought that physics, after all, particularly since the 17th century, physics is really regarded as the basic and the fundamental model science, and the other sciences are trying to model themselves after physics. I'm not entirely sure this is even a good thing. because I think physics, especially since the 17th century, presupposes certain kinds of assumptions about nature, etc., which could be disastrous if other subjects like biology or psychology try to model themselves after it. But I suspect that's probably the main reason, that physics really is a very basic fundamental science. You can study physics without studying geology or chemistry, but you can't do it in reverse. You can't study geology or chemistry without studying physics. So similarly, biology is the fundamental life science, really, and even though we have had more or less constant attempts to, in some senses, reduce biology to physics, but basically this is an entirely hopeless pursuit.
Yeah.
And therefore it is recognized by practically everybody, especially in any case biologists, that there are certain laws that enter in the laws of the living organism that are just different. So therefore biology...
But these are sciences that are asking basic questions too.
Sure.
The same kinds of, in a sense, very similar kinds of questions to those that you posed for religion. And they're all asking questions that relate to something else you referred to earlier, I think, the path. You talked about being on a path.
Well, I think this is an area particularly which is often neglected, I think, in terms of religions. Because anybody who wishes to do scientific research, for example, understands, and even those who are not actually doing research understand, that somebody needs to have some training here, some background here. Somehow one has to learn how to conduct research. To be sure, there are people who are somewhat naturally gifted for this, so they become very great researchers. And there are some who are not at all gifted for it, and whatever method they might be subjected to, they would never become good researchers. So we always have a variety like this. But we don't seem to remember this in connection with religion. That all the great teachers are not simply speaking about their conclusion of what they saw, but they are also bringing a path or a way by which a person who is willing to undertake this journey and is of course willing to pay the price that is required for this, can himself or herself come to the realization of truth, which they themselves may not necessarily put in the same words or phrases or metaphors as even the original teacher did. We have a statue of the Buddha here. That would be a very good example one could take. After all, the Buddha did not simply enunciate his principle or the noble truth about the dukkha or what is the cause of dukkha. And he didn't simply say, well, look, he did in fact apparently said that he was awake. He's the Buddha. That's what the Buddha means. But he also brought the Eightfold Path through which anybody who wished to undertake this and who was willing to pay the requisite price, is the way I put it, but it could be put any other way, who was willing to exert himself, anybody could come to nirvana. So it's this, specifically the idea that there are paths through which human being can be transformed. And that unless a person is transformed, he cannot see the truth. This is really, if you like, especially these days, you see, I also teach courses in comparative religion. These days it is a very important area of research really within religion itself. What is religion? After all, what is common to all these various religions? There are hardly anything one can be so clear about. For example, if you think in terms of God, there are religions which don't believe in God. If you think of any other style or system or idea, but in the process one begins to discover that there are one or two or three things that one can say which are common to all religions. One is, all religions say, to be sure they say it in different metaphors or different ways, but they all say that a human being does not live as he or she should and could live. Now, whether they say that the person is living in sin and not in the grace of God, or whether they say that a person is living in Maya and not in reality, or whether they say a person is living in dukkha and not in liberation or in nirvana. So they may put this in varieties of ways. But if we were to sort of stand apart and say what is common to them, one of the things which is common to them is this diagnosis of the human situation, in which they would say that from their perspective, these teachers' perspective, people are not living as they might. Furthermore, that some transformation is needed before they can in fact understand the level of truth from where these teachers are talking about. Now, for example, Jesus Christ might say, unless you're born again, you cannot come to the Spirit or to God. But the Buddha might say, unless you're transformed, you cannot come to the Buddha mind, or unless you see it, the whole thing from the Buddha mind, you can't come to nirvana.
Or somebody else might say, you just need to wake up.
That's right. But you see, the point nevertheless is that there is our ordinary human situation. On the other hand, these teachers are always saying that it is possible for us to be different. And in order to be different, in order to be transformed, or in order to be reborn, there are instructions, there are paths. This is what I mean by a path. So,
yes.
Unless, and essentially, really, I mean, my own impression is the summary of this. This is my summary of it anyway. Of all the religions, the fundamental thing that stands in our way is that we are too full of ourselves. And as long as I am full of myself, I cannot be filled with God. It's as simple as that. Every religion says this in one word or the other, one way or the other. So, how to be free of oneself? How to be a little less full of oneself? How to make room for something which is larger, which is higher? Now, this is not something that you just think, well, it's a good idea, so now I am free of myself. That's obviously not the way it becomes.
There's some very difficult work involved there, isn't there?
Very difficult work involved, because we
it sounds in a way like a very simple kind of a problem, and one ought to be able to quite clearly see what the problem is and get into solving it, but it's really very difficult.
It is very difficult because we are really fundamentally attached to ourselves. And to some extent, I think our problem is to totally reconstruct the ship while the ship is on the ocean. Because we are the ones who are asking even these kinds of questions. We are the ones who want to undertake the journey, and we always naturally begin from where we are. And where we are full of ourselves.
Yes.
So we begin from there. But how to begin from where one is and to really move towards something which, strictly speaking, is not clear to us and cannot be clear to us in principle until we are already transformed.
Right. Now, the thing that strikes me in this kind of conversation is that what we're talking about really is transformation at a personal, individual level, that people individually are full of themselves and need to somehow find a way to change that. And then we're looking at a society and at a world that's much larger and much more complex. And part of that complexity has to do with science and the related technologies to science that seem to create for us what feels like a tremendous pace of change and a scale of things in which things seem to kind of get out of our control. And I'm wondering what we can say about that problem of being full of ourselves on a larger scale. And it seems to me that this might draw us into some dealing with some of the value or ethical kinds of questions that confront us, whether we are scientists or whether we are religionists.
Yes. To some extent, it is without question true that there is always an interaction between any individual living in this anywhere and the cultural, societal environment. By environment, I don't obviously mean simply the biophysical environment, although that's also important, but also, if you like, the psychological environment, the social relationships, the political situation, whether there is any kind of peace or rest, or whether there is enough food to eat or not to eat. All these are part of the environment, which can lead one or lead a lot of us living in the society, a large numbers of us, into kind of an anxiety and more competition, and just each person for himself, getting as much as we can. So there are no doubt social conditions which lead to that sort of attitude. It's really, it's my own impression that at any given time in history, the real problem is not easy. Whether you take the time of Socrates or the time of the Buddha or the time of Jesus Christ, you name any person's time. The real problem fundamentally is our ego. That is the problem. Now, that is not any more easy for us than it was for people at the time of the Buddha. But I don't think it's any more complicated for us than it was at his time. Because meanwhile, of course, the social conditions change, to which science and technology, in my judgment, add more than almost any other factor in the social conditions. So technology in particular, especially in the last, well, it depends really how far back one wants to go, but we could all agree that particularly in the last 100 years, there has been an accelerating pace of technology, which in general seems to mean that there is more and more premium on novelty, there is a premium on technological innovation and corresponding industrial exploitation of these, and once you have them, especially in a capitalist system, then it is necessary to sell these things, so you create a whole propaganda machinery, which we call advertising, which basically creates artificial desires, that this is what we need.
Yes.
So then we are in this kind of a ever-accelerating rat race in which we need more and more money, and so we get busier and busier trying to get this so that we buy the things which we have been told we need. All right. So it is quite possible that overall the whole social condition would become accelerated in an anxious way, in an anxiety-producing way. On the other hand, it is, after all, the concomitant movements within the same societies that the same technology or a similar technology also produces certain labor-saving devices, for example. So my impression is that really, to be sure, there is always a little bit up and down, but basically the fundamental problem does not change. And I think I'm now largely repeating it, but it's slightly maybe in different words. It's useful because we don't really want to hear this, because it is absolutely close to the heart. That the fundamental problem is that a large part of us wishes to live in illusion. We don't actually want to be transformed. We pay lip service to this, especially in a gathering like this. After all, you can't be a member of the Theosophical Society without saying you want to be transformed. It doesn't, you sort of lose your membership. But anybody who seriously undertakes a look at oneself, even when we speak about wanting to be transformed, we want to remain the same and be transformed. It's a curious thing.
We don't want to give up anything.
That's
we
right.
just want more.
That's right, exactly. But we want to get to heaven with the same feet of clay, which is to say with our personal ambitions, with our personal glory, with having an orchestra in the background. Whereas all of them say you can come to heaven precisely when you are nobody there, right? When you are not yourself, right? When you're freed of this. This sounds sort of paradoxical, but I don't think it's that much of a paradox. At least conceptually, it is obvious. The paradox is that the very person who wants to go to heaven, the very person who wants to be transformed, is the one who is going to be removed from the center stage. And that's what he doesn't want to do. So one wants to be transformed, but remain center stage.
Which is sort of a contradiction in terms, yes. It seems as though it always kind of comes down always to the fact that in terms of people being transformed, that it's a one-to-one kind of a basis, that it's something that has to be done by each person somehow out of their own experience. That in what sense can we is it possible to think about transformation taking place on a larger scale than the individual?
Well, in a way, I mean, I have a feeling that I understand your question, but strictly speaking, it is a question which is very artificial. It is really the same kind of prejudice that we have about religion and science being opposed to each other, and then one wonders how come somebody is doing both. An individual means really nothing except a network of social relationships. And a network of social relationships means nothing other than some individuals in relationship. But to put it maybe a little differently, this may sound like just moonshine, but to me it's plain as anything. If a wise man sits in this room, the whole air around or in the room changes. This isn't moonshine, and you know it.
So the individual has
then if you sit next
others
to a person like this and breathe the same air, or sit in his aura, or take his emanation or his vibration, it heals you. Holy people heal by their mere presence, just as crazy people make us sick by their mere presence, or wicked people, if you like.
Yes.
So this whole idea of a social transformation being somehow a different ball game from an individual transformation, I understand what you're saying. In a way, there are other kind of issues which are larger, like social justice. There is racial prejudice. There is not appropriate distribution of wealth or of food.
Large-scale things.
There is no question in my mind.
People feel an anxiety about how are we going to make a difference? How are we going to be able to change that? Not by my going into an ashram, perhaps. Those are the kinds of questions that I'm...
Sure, and I don't think there is any kind of a contradiction between this. In a certain way, I am almost inclined to think that if you look at the suggestions of any of the great teachers, and I'm really less interested in religions, they're just mumbo-jumbo around what these great teachers were saying. But if you just look at what the great teachers themselves said and did, all of them were naturally compassionate, naturally merciful, naturally did good works. They weren't sort of specially setting out programs of donations of something or the other. But even that, they occasionally even recommended that to their students or disciples, because in a certain way, ultimately, good works or good actions or naturally right distribution of things and goods needs to come from clear seeing that I am in fact as much not only my brother's keeper, but I am in fact my brother. If I see this, then there is no need to have a separate program for this good work. But it is on the other hand true, and these great teachers have almost always seen, that their followers don't naturally see this. Therefore, they often suggest to them practices which give them, if you like, habit of thinking about others. Therefore, they have practices do certain charitable acts or good works or give money to people or to poor, etc., etc. All religions suggest this.
Yes, yes.
So that it does become a part of our organism. But fundamentally, this is not the, if you like, the direction is not going to be ever from outside inward. Direction is always the other way around.
It always arises from within, from the center.
That's right. But on the other hand, since that's not where we are usually seated,
and it emanates out.
That's right. So we need a certain practice for this.
Yes.
So the practice can be of charity or association with good people, reading certain kinds of things, doing certain, for example, prayers, meditation. These are all practices.
A real change of consciousness is what you're talking about taking place.
That's right.
Within the person, and that spreads.
And we all know this, but somehow, in fact, there is nothing that I have said which isn't just ordinary common sense. It's almost like saying water is wet, but it somehow needs to be said.
We always have to go back and say these things again and again. And I think, I guess some of the kinds of larger issues that I raise come out of a sense of what we were talking about earlier as fear and anxiety. Fear maybe on a different scale than had been felt in earlier times. We have a fear for life on the planet, for example.
Sure, but you see, even there, I think there is certainly no contradiction that I can see why a person who, in whatever way they understand it, are undertaking any program of self-transformation, why should this exclude whatever they understand is any program of social transformation? For example, one could take specific examples. Supposing one said, well, my program of personal transformation is practice of Zen, and on the other hand, a program of social transformation may be for us to work for disarmament. Otherwise, we are going to blow ourselves up many times over with the nuclear bombs.
And these can be carried on simultaneously.
I certainly see almost no reason why they can't be carried on simultaneously. To be sure, like every other activity, we sometimes need to have a certain set of conditions in which we concentrate on one thing or the other. But this is like a scientist going into the laboratory. So maybe a person who is practicing Zen meditation very hard may need to enter a monastery for a little while, like entering a laboratory. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't just stay there. In fact, if you look at, again, as I said, it's always useful to come back to the great spiritual masters themselves. Some of them, in fact, all of them, for a little while, retired into the desert or onto the mountaintop or whatever, the Buddha, for example, or Jesus Christ. But then they actually engage with this very world. So, in a way, it seems to me, after all, when we speak about personal transformation, what are we talking about? We're not talking about having more money added to my personal bank account. Personal transformation, if it has any meaning at all, strictly speaking means that I would then naturally see that I'm not the center of the universe. And if I, in fact, would naturally see this, rather than just think, well, I may still remain the center of the universe while I am getting transformed, but if I would actually genuinely be transformed, all my activities cannot be anything but for the sake of the world.
Yes. And in choosing a path, what kinds of options do you identify for people who want to embark on the path to attempt to
this is
confront the question?
Not a way of avoiding the question, but I feel to some extent, I would even say to a large extent, to choose a path is really a little bit like choosing a wife. From a man's point of view, no doubt from a woman's point of view, maybe choosing a husband. Because at any given time, for example, you and I are more or less the same age. When we were young and starry-eyed, we can picture that no doubt at that time there were easily 1 billion women on the face of this earth who were more or less suitable marriageable age for us. Right? So theoretically we could say, now how are we going to decide
to make a
out of
decision
this
among
1
those
billion
billion.
women who we're going to get
Yes.
married? But now you know and I know this is not how one goes about it, right?
It's not how it works. Right.
So I think it is important to really keep in mind that the choosing of the spiritual path is not like, well, here are 40 kinds of toothpaste and which one should I choose? This is not how it works
That's right.
at all.
Yes.
It is really much closer to how one ends up, if you like, somehow, someday, discovering that this is the woman I'm now going to marry. Now, that does not mean if we have any kind of an integrity, we could not say, at least let me speak for myself, I could not say that there could not be any other woman for me to marry, and this will be silly. And certainly it does not mean that I can't respect other women, or even admire their beauty or charm or wit or intelligence or whatever. Nevertheless, most of the time, when we think of choosing a path, we have almost this kind of strange notion as if this has got to be the best, as if nothing else is in the running, etc. This is
Yes.
not how it works.
And as if it can't change from time to time.
Again, I would say anybody who is genuinely on any path, one of the ways you would recognize this is a kind of an enlargement of feeling or of thought. A person on any genuine path does not put down others who are on other paths.
And this can take place anywhere, can it?
Sure, sure.
In any kind of work that a person might be doing, that work could constitute a path in itself.
And also, I want to make one other remark here. It sort of seems like the devil quoting the scriptures, but maybe. You know, there is a very interesting remark of Jesus Christ in John's Gospel, where his disciples are occasionally getting disheartened, and occasionally they get very encouraged, etc., etc. And in one place he says, "You're not the one who chose me. I chose you." And I think it is actually something which we don't somehow hear very often. I don't think we are really the ones who choose a path. Somehow I think paths also choose us. It's a curious, but I should more say, and it's a little bit coming back to what I was saying earlier, there is an interaction. In my judgment, it is wholly erroneous to think, really I think stupid as a matter of fact, not only erroneous, to think that there are no other forces in the world, that I am somehow deciding, I decided to grow just this kind of nose on me, and just this kind of digestive system on me, or in me, and just this kind of sun which will give me the light, or this is the kind of water that I wanted to drink, so I decided to develop this. I mean, just the idea of it is so entirely absurd when one thinks. At any given time, absolutely any time, if we actually look around and think commonsensically, most of the things that we need to eat or to breathe, or the air, the water, the food, the sunshine, etc., we didn't make any of it. I certainly didn't. One is here in the midst of very large forces. And there is no reason for us to somehow believe, which is again a curious cultural habit we have, as if the universe is passive out there. We can decide something about it. I can choose this, or I can choose that, or I can exploit this part of nature, or I can help this or that. There is an interaction all the time between what we call the cosmos and what we call ourselves. In a way, even this way of speaking is somewhat silly. I mean, after all, I'm not out of the cosmos.
Yes.
I am a part of this.
You're part of it.
And in this sort of an interactive system, various forces and various if you like, collocations of energy or matter, aggregations of matter energy, which is after all what I am, what you are, or of consciousness, these are interacting with each other all the time. In that interaction, of course, there are paths, there are teachers, there are forces of various kinds. And you and I and everybody else, we walk through different people's atmosphere or their auras, if you like. And we come across certain kind of literature, etc., etc. But it is possible for us to think that it is wholly accidental. It's possible for us to think any crazy thing we like. But I mean, if we are really going to be even commonsensical about this, it is also possible for us to think that there is some rhyme or reason to all this. After all, I'm not here contrary to universal laws.
Yes. I certainly have to say that in the changes that I've experienced in my own life over the years, I have consistently had the feeling that something has brought me here that I didn't plan, that I had not very much to do with.
But you know,
that's a sense of the path, feeling that the path has somehow
in
called.
In a sense, if you like, we can
me.
sometimes personify these things,
Yes.
and we say the path has called me, as if it has a voice. Right? But this is a manner of speaking.
And very often it manifests itself in the sense that I think that I'm on a particular quest or journey.
That's right.
And then I suddenly find that I've been diverted in another direction by something that presented itself.
Sure.
And it becomes a very significant thing that was very different from what I thought I was after.
Exactly. Exactly.
And,
but you see, we can certainly also convince ourselves as if there is a, as if there is a cosmic party going on. We weren't invited because somehow the forces didn't want us, and this is accidental. We just happened to hear about it, and we crashed the party. And now we sort of sneaked in, and now, by God, I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of losing my relationship or connection, so I can get more and more anxious because somehow I have a wrong starting point. As if this party is going on, I'm not invited to this. I somehow sneaked in.
I don't
and now
belong
I have to
here.
find it. I don't belong here.
In reality, the cosmic party has invited us.
Well, look, those forces are so large. I often say, well, if they didn't want me, they don't have to have me here.
Yes.
Right? So why they're stuck with me? But now, that also means within this whole context, I have a certain part to play.
And that's what makes it a party, really,
right.
isn't it?
Yeah. So we're not here, therefore, trying to somehow hide ourselves, to think, well, they'll find us out and kick us out. And so I want to cling to life. Well, when the party is over, so party moves somewhere else. After all, these forces and these laws are operating. I didn't make them, at least not in any personal sense. But to the extent that I am a part of this cosmos, sure, I am also part of the forces that made it all.
This image of the cosmic party probably is a very good one for us to end on. Thank you very much, Dr. Ravindra.
Thank you. I think it's always a matter for celebration.
Thank you.